Hello everybody and welcome to today's talk. We're very happy to welcome back to the library, albeit unfortunately a virtual library at the moment, Tim G, whose association with WCML goes back a very long way, as he may tell you. He'll be speaking on the topic Peace and Equality, Two Sides of the Same Coin, and that links in with his recent publication, Why I Am a Pacifist. I'll just mention again that our events are, as usual, free, but we do very much value donations, and thank you to those of you who have done that. There's a donate button on your website if you feel able to help us in that way. Okay, over to you, Tim.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you for welcoming me. As Lynette said, I'm Tim G. I'm a campaigner, a writer, a pacifist, talking about peace and equality. Yes, with many associations with the library. Spent a good deal of time there as a child because Alan is my stepdad, so I have very fond memories of Ruth and Eddie as well. So sorry not to be with you in the annex, which is where I imagine this would have been, because we're in lockdown, the library's closed, as are many places, so we're doing this on Zoom. One of the things I've been doing a lot, as I imagine you have in this time, is a lot of reading. And I've been doing a lot of thinking about the peace and social justice movement of a century or so ago, when the links between peace and equality seemed to be particularly strong at that point. And sometime over the last century or so, and I haven't quite managed to pinpoint when, these seem to separate in people's minds. So over the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to try and give a brief tour of the peace movement as it was a century or so ago. I then want to make an argument about peace and equality today, and then I want to try and anticipate some of the questions that people quite often ask pacifists. So we're going to begin by travelling back a century. The Great War, so-called, was over, or at least it was in many people's minds. I'll come back to a caveat on that in a moment. Women had recently won the vote, or at least some women had. Trade union membership was surging. The relatively new Labour Party was becoming more and more popular, and many countries were experiencing a revolutionary spirit. And in amongst all this, there was this still relatively new word, pacifism, that only came into the English language in the very early 20th century. So by 2020, I suppose it was a kind of moody teenager. It was explicitly coined to describe active work for the conditions of peace. And it was very strongly present in those movements. So maybe the biggest peace group of that time was the Union for Democratic Control. There's a collection related to that at the library. They called for many things. They were potentially one of the more moderate of the peace groups, but one of the things that they called for was that they said that at the end of the Great War, there needed to be a peace agreement that neither humiliates the defeated nation nor artificially rearranges frontiers, as this might provide a cause for future wars. That's a direct quote. And of course, they were right. Although they were either ignored in their time, or worse, they were hounded by the gutter press to make those views unacceptable. There were a very small number of aid workers who travelled from Britain to Germany in the wake of the Great War. One of them was Joan Fry, who some of her letters back have recently been republished in a recently published book. I want to read just a couple of extracts from that. She wrote, "The shock and despair felt by ordinary people in the wake of the Treaty of Versailles was impossible to ignore." And she talks about meeting an old lady who explained that though she felt no hatred towards the English during the war, the Treaty of Versailles aroused intense resentment. Another person expressed about a dread of the future, saying, "We must drill hatred into our children so that 30 years when the time is ripe, it tails off there." But, you know, Joan Fry's warning was right, but her warning was ignored. And I mentioned before that, of course, in some ways, the so-called Great War didn't finish, because after anti-war protests turned into the revolution in Russia, some countries decided they were going to continue fighting there. And there were big protests in England and other countries against war with Russia, coordinated by the National Council of Action, and in solidarity with dock workers who'd refused to refuel a ship that was carrying munitions to be used in the war. And in the same year was the first ever World Conference of Quakers, people from all over the world, different tendencies, different countries. And they came together to reaffirm the peace testimony. And an interesting kind of footnote into that is that their very first action was a letter of solidarity to the National Council of Action. And, you know, from a century on, we might wonder what might have happened if those voices had have won out. How might have Russia developed differently if the very early years of the war, of the revolution, hadn't have needed to have been committed to war? Might the Cold War have been avoided? Would the bomb still have been built? And sadly, we can only wonder. Straight after the World Conference of Friends, there was a follow-up gathering about war and the social order. One of the speeches said, "It's futile to protest against war or to plead for peace if we tolerate any longer the present social order, which has greed for its motive, unrestrained competition for its method, and universal war for its inevitable end." One of the best known speakers there was George Lansbury, but it's the opening speech from that event that really haunts me. It was delivered by someone called Mary King Emmett. She described a prevailing undercurrent in the country in 1920 of people feeling let down after the war that could lead either to construction of a better system or to a revengeful spirit that would threaten Western civilization. And of course, she was right, but she was ignored. Before moving forward in time, I want to mention the No Conscription Fellowship, another group who I believe there's some materials from them in the library as well. And that was laid down in 1919. We had a conference to mark that centenary last year. And that was a group led by visionaries like Leela and Fenner Brockway, people who campaigned for peace, but also for Indian independence, for freedom for the colonies more widely, for women's right to vote, for economic equality in Britain, but also through the world. And that lives on through the organisation War on Want, of which Fenner Brockway was a founder. So the Brockways rejected this really narrow view of peace, and they saw peace and equality as two sides of the same coin, which is, I suppose, a fairly long preamble to what I want to make as the main argument of my talk. And I've dwelled on it because I find it interesting, but also to emphasize that this was a time when the modern peace movement, as we know it now, was still young. The word pacifism was still young. It was kind of the teenager of its time, a Greta Thunberg type figure offering prophetic foresight and fully part of campaigns for equality. Now, I want to make the main argument, and I want to use using a word that was certainly not around in 1920. It was coined by the US academic and civil rights advocate Kimberlé Crenshaw in 1989 as a prism for understanding how different forms of injustice and oppression compound one another. And that word is intersectionality. And the intersection of the metaphor is the crossroads where traffic, traveling roads shaped by racism, sexism, classism, ageism, disableism, homophobia, or transphobia converge, leading to the risk of harm being done to any person at the intersection. And I think it's a very useful word, and it's one that applies well to what I want to say here, because for the student of war and of peace, that frame applies to the outbreak of armed conflict, where the effects of different forms of injustice come together in this profoundly violent way. So this is I think the last of 10 talks that I've done about this book, and most of them were last year, of course. And something that surprised me, that a good deal of people in my audience seem to be quite surprised by this argument, and this puzzles me. And of course, I'm glad to be doing something useful, presenting a view that maybe people haven't heard before, but it's not a new approach. So as I said at the start, somewhere along the way, peace and equality seem to have got separated in a lot of people's minds, too many people's minds. So that's why I'm going to carry on to talk about race, about gender, and about class as related to war and peace. So let's talk about race, and let's return to the present to the news this week, the Black Lives Matter protests in the US, following yet more blatant extreme violence by police against black and brown people. But also the news revealed this week in the UK that showed that people of colour in England are 54% more likely to be fined under the coronavirus regulations than white people. And this builds on the extreme inequalities that already exist. People of colour are less likely to be in secure work, and those who are less likely, and they're also less likely, those who are in work are less likely to be able to access personal protective equipment. A great many people in the UK who were born abroad, many of them BAME people, were excluded from the government support under the cruel no recourse to public funds rules. And you might have seen that at committee last week, Boris Johnson gave the impression that he didn't even know about these rules. And probably as a result of these combined factors, I'm sure that investigations will go into this more deeply, but probably as a result of these combined factors, people of colour are significantly more likely to die of coronavirus. And this is violence. And this is and should be, in my view, the concern of a pacifist. And this might seem quite different from what you might expect a pacifist to talk about peace and about war, but in my view, all of this is absolutely intertwined with war, because war would be impossible without racism. Or put another way, racism is one of those roads that leads to war. Racism is the idea that it's okay for people with one identity, be that a national, a religious, or a racial identity, to kill people with a different identity. And that's not inherent, it's not natural to anyone, but instead it's learnt, and to some extent it's taught. And amongst the institutions that do the teaching are governments at times of war, who persuade their populations that it's okay to kill people who've been born elsewhere and to rule over those people who remain. This has effects. The war mindset leads to street violence and abuse against people perceived to share the nationality, the ethnicity, or the religion of those places which the government is at war with, or whose lands they've colonized. I'm sure, I was walking through Market Street, through the Piccadilly Gardens, around the time of the invasion of Afghanistan. And I think I was about 16. And that was the first time that I heard someone shout Osama bin Laden at a brown-skinned man with a beard in the street. And I was very shocked by that at the time, but it's painfully common. So that's just one example of that. And this is the mindset that leads to the different treatment that white and non-white people get from the police, as we've been seeing so explicitly in the US, but in the UK as well. So to say again, racism is one of those roads that war in turn leads back to state and street violence at home. I also want to talk about gender and about sexuality. This has been very important in my journey into pacifism. I think I became a pacifist at school, and that was after, through most of school, feeling this pressure to engage or to be willing to engage in fighting. And on the last day of school, something happened that I explain in the book that made me want to resist that. But this path that to the ideas that link masculinity, especially heteromasculinity, to violence, it starts early. If you're male, or you grew up being perceived as male, I'd invite you to think, did anyone ever give you a toy soldier or a gun to play with? Were you ever invited to watch a war film or go to an air show? And all of this can, explicitly so, form part of a government-supported strategy of preparing boys to become men who fight and kill in war. Sometimes actually when they're still boys, but we'll also come back to that. And if it works. If you picture all of the world's soldiers today in one place, the vast majority of those people will be non-trans straight men. There have been some reforms, including in the UK, but that's all very recent and has all been resisted from a great many in the most senior ranks. So this acculturation of men to be willing to be violent very likely has side effects. The vast majority of terrorist attacks by men Most knife crime is by men. Most domestic abuse is perpetrated by men. Most of the politicians who send people to war are men. And again, you know, the fact that there are female soldiers and the fact there are male peacemakers shows that this isn't biologically determined. Men are taught to be ready to fight. And it can be very hard to undo this, but I think that trying to undo it is part of the role of the pacifist. And again, this might seem slightly different from what you might expect to hear talk about peace, but again, I want to emphasize that without this toxic masculinity, I don't think we would have war, or at least not in the form that we know today. Now, there's very many factors in this, and I've only got time to talk about 3, but the third I want to talk about is class, because typically the people who profit from resources won in war are usually the very rich. Middle-class people are sometimes recruited to the officer class. Actually, someone once attempted to recruit me to the officer training corps when I was at university, and I said, I don't think that's a very good idea, I'm a pacifist. And they said, oh, that's okay, we embrace diversity, which is not my idea of diversity. Of course, this is funny, but it links to a very serious point, which is that it's working class people who are principally recruited to fight and die in those wars for those resources. There was a report last year, you might have seen it, from Child Soldiers International, that showed that working class areas, they're the ones that are targeted for army recruitment. And many of those people are under 18. Many of those people, when they come back, they become homeless or need medical assistance to help with PTSD. And there's not enough support for those people. You probably know the slogan of a bayonet is a weapon with a worker at both ends. Keir Hardie tried to stop what we now call the First World War with a mass general strike, but it didn't work. Even the party he helped found supported what we now call the First World War. And according to his partner Sylvia Pankhurst, Hardie's broken heart contributed to his early death. But thanks to places like the Working Class Movement Library, as well as different books and so on, Hardie and people of that time, they still speak to us through the century. And they're still right when they say that if workers refuse to fight, there could be no war. And I want to relate this to our current coronavirus crisis too. I was hearing some commentary from the great novelist Arundhati Roy the other week, and she's talking about the separation in India between what she calls the flying classes and the walking classes. And she warns that very soon the two could become hermetically sealed from one another. And in the UK, the government guidance at the moment is that those who can work from home are being told to work from home. It's more likely that those people are going to be middle class, whilst other people are being told to go back to work. State schools are being told to go back. All around where I am, all around the schools, there are posters up on the lampposts pointing out that Eton isn't going back until September. So if this leads, as it seems likely it will, if this leads to even greater health inequalities, then it points once again to the violence that is being done and is growing out of the inequality of class. And there's a link here too, back to the movement of a century or so ago, which we started with. One of the figures of that time was H.G. Wells, certainly not a pacifist. He's credited with that description of the Great War as the war to end all wars, which obviously it wasn't. But he did write a prophetic book, The Time Machine, in 1895. Perhaps you know it. He paints a picture of a dystopian future where the working classes and the owning classes have become hermetically sealed from one another. So much in his story that they've morphed into different species. It's quite a gruesome story. And it's fiction, not a prediction. But I think that book is worth revisiting and rereading in the current context. So my question is, why, after having precedents a century old, does an intersectional approach to making peace meet resistance today? And it could be that in the face of such entrenched injustice, it can be hard to imagine what peace would actually look like. So I'd like to start by picturing a more equal world, free of racism, free of toxic forms of masculinity, free of other discriminatory worldviews. And then perhaps we can hold an image, maybe even a feeling of that peaceful world within reach. Or it might be that if you are white like me, male like me, or middle class like me, it can be troubling to feel that we might be a moving part in that injustice that we stand against. And if that's you, it's okay to feel that discomfort. It's good. It's an opportunity to think about things differently. Because if you find yourself part of the white power structure, the male power structure, or the structure of class and economic privilege, then you're well placed to throw a spanner in the works of that machine by being an ally or an accomplice to movements of the less privileged. And again, in Fenner Brockway or Keir Hardie, maybe there's some inspiration for how we could do so. So yeah, I'm a pacifist, but I haven't been on a peace march for quite a long time now, and not just because of the lockdown. A lot of my activism, especially recently, has been on the topic of domestic abuse, and trying to fundraise for and support people trying to change the rules so that migrants can access state support if they're at risk, rather than what can happen at the moment. And what does sometimes happen at the moment is that people, migrant women in particular, can run the risk of deportation and detention if they present to the authorities. I also try to talk to the peace movement about how our approach could be broadened into an approach which I fully admit is ambitious, but stands a better chance of ending war than if we remain in this narrowly defined peace box, very often as defined by other people. So I'm looking forward to stopping for questions in a little while. But before doing so, I want to pause on some of the questions that people very often come to talks on pacifism and peace with. So one question is whether I believe in defense. And my answer to that is yes. But I often find out that I maybe understand that differently to how the questionnaire intends. Because if you look to the history of almost any major war in the world, it's very likely you'll be able to trace how that combination of toxic masculinity, racism and classism and other forms of inequality help pave the way for the conflict. So tackling those injustices is the best route to global security. But let's look at what the UK government is doing at the moment. Instead of doing that, it's pouring money into weapons like the Trident submarines, should I say. And those weapons don't protect us from the major threats that we face. I haven't even mentioned the climate crisis yet. There's been repeated warnings that have gone unheeded. Violence is being perpetrated through extreme weather as a result of the climate breakdown. It looks likely to spread. But overall, the world's governments spend 12 times as much on war and preparing for war as they do on tackling climate change. So this is just one example of how spending this money differently could go a long way towards defending us from the threats that we face. A second, reasonable enough question is whether the means justify the ends, and we need to ask which means and which ends, but usually this is a question about whether violence could be used to win peace or used to win equality. But usually the means and the ends are inseparable. The means shape the ends, so the hierarchy inherent in winning change through war is very often reflected in post-transitional societies. Social approval for violence as a tool of political change very often then gives legitimacy to those who don't like the actions of the post-liberation governments to pursue their agendas through violence. And then this leads to greater state repression in response and a downward spiral of harm. And sadly, we've seen this in the 20th century many times. But following on from my argument, I do also want to challenge the ostensibly non-violent movements, including the ones that we so often celebrate. Because, you know, there are some very well-researched studies that show that unarmed people power campaigns are more than twice as likely to win in whole or part compared to those using armed resistance. But I think the pacifist or the peacemaker has to point out that this is actually very rarely led to the election of governments willing to renounce violence abroad. We also need to think about Gandhi and Martin Luther King and be mindful that for all their strategic foresight and leadership, they weren't as appreciative of the importance of gender equality as they could have been. So as a result, the progress won by those movements wasn't accompanied by an equivalent improvement in women's rights. So here too, the means influence the ends. If ostensibly non-violent movements don't join up the dots between the different forms of structural violence and inequality during their mass campaigns, then the chances are that the governments and the policies that follow their revolutions will fail to do so too. Okay, nearly there. Next, how would I respond to those movements that are of the oppressed, but who aren't exclusively non-violent? I think this question is what's being touched on in the great preamble to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that says it's essential that if human is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law. So the first mission of the peacemaker is to build the conditions where there's recourse to non-violent means. But what about when people's rights aren't being protected? And when they rebel through means that include violence. And I suppose there's different approaches people take. If I made an exception, and if I said that I support the right to violence of any oppressed group, I could find myself supporting the Islamic State if I followed that through to its logical conclusion, among other groups that abuse human rights. And I don't want to do that. I can't and I won't say that. On the other hand, if I said that I condemned all people, all groups that are not 100% committed to non-violence, then that would have ruled out dialogue with the ANC in the anti-apartheid struggle and the Black Panthers in the US civil rights movement and many other examples past and present. So I think the truth that any pacifist needs to admit is that most people are not pacifists. This is a minority interest. Therefore, social change by definition means working with people who are not pacifists. And to return to those two examples, in the anti-apartheid struggle, plenty of pacifists engaged in the South African boycott, anti-conscription campaigns, progress towards a negotiated way forward, and so on. In the Black Power movement, there's examples of Quaker meetings working with local Panthers in the food distribution and breakfast programs in Philadelphia and Baltimore. There's just two examples, plenty more that we could think of today. I'd like to quote Adam Curl. He's one of the pioneers of peace studies. He says that to criticize a person or group caught up in a situation for the way that they're dealing with it is rarely a helpful route to understanding. And we might add that to do so without recognizing the violence of the structures they're fighting would be hypocritical. So from a position of solidarity, working against the same injustice, but from a position of solidarity working against the same injustice, I think we should share the view that violence isn't right or effective. And people may not agree, but for parties in conflicts to know that a peacemaker is themselves committed to non-violence, that makes it much more likely that a mediated route to peace with justice might be found. Okay, finally, would this approach have stopped Hitler? My answer is yes. 100 years of yes. As I shared in the first part of this talk, in 1920, and indeed earlier than that, many pacifists, among others, could see what was coming and tried to warn against it, but they were ignored. And of course, we know now that Nazism grew in Germany thanks to racism, thanks to a patriarchal notion of regaining national pride after the crisis of the First World War and the Versailles Treaty. And because of such fear among the elite of wealth being redistributed by the left, that instead they sided with the far right. And I feel genuinely fearful saying this, but I see comparable factors today. But rather than take these as the lessons of history, elites have used the memory of World War II to justify continued imperialist violence. And let's name it. Comparisons to Hitler and the Second World War were used to inform decisions to assassinate Congo's first democratic prime minister, Patrice Lumumba, to imprison Ghana's independence leader, Kwame Nkrumah, and to put hundreds of thousands of people in detention camps in Kenya in which tens of thousands of people died. And similar rhetoric was used to justify the bombing of Afghanistan in 2001, of Iraq in 2003, of Libya in 2011, of Syria in 2015. Each of these led to countless people being killed, and they led to further conflict. So supporters of the war will always search for that exception to the rule against violence and then work from there to defend the use of armed force more broadly. And the focus of this argument is different. It's about identifying the causes of war and violence and finding ways to transform them. And I've been arguing today that that principal cause of war is inequality. So that's why I called this talk Peace and Equality, Two Sides of the Same Coin. And I accept that this task of transformation is vast, that each of us will only play a small part in this change, but also that our actions sometimes have effects we'd never dream of. Sometimes our words will be found in a library like this and read again a century later. In preparation for this, I've been trying to explain to George Lansbury that we were going to be talking about his ideas, talking through our typewriters with something called Zoom and YouTube, connected by this thing called the internet. There will be things in the future that we can never dream of. But it begins with an approach and a commitment. I find that it's one that some kind of faith is tremendously helpful in for sustaining us in, but whatever our faith or otherwise, I really believe that if each of us looks deep inside ourselves, we'll discover what role each of us has. Because these are times of crisis too. Just as in 1920, today there is a prevailing undercurrent of people feeling let down, which could lead either to construction of a better system or to a revengeful spirit which will threaten civilization. So this time we need to not just be right, but we need to be heard. We need to move things in the right direction again. And that's where I'm going to end. Thank you very much for listening. Wow.
There are some things to think about there. There are some challenges put to us. Thank you very much, Tim. You've answered a lot of questions in advance, which is very clever. That's the first person to have done that, but that's that's very interesting, the way that you develop your argument that way. But obviously, folks, if you do have a question for Tim or a comment, there are some things in the chat already, but do type something in there, or if I toggle myself back to gallery view, I can also, if anybody really wants to wave at me to say something, I'll try and see if I can see anybody waving at me, and I'll unmute you. Any waving going on? Okay, while we're waiting for that, there's certainly Sue Richardson. I know there was something else from Sue earlier, but this one here. At what point do you draw the line between individual and group action? E.g., if I were assaulted by a man, I would probably take my mother's advice and stamp on his feet with high heels. But I agree that this is not an effective fight in groups or nations.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the texts I'd like to have mentioned in the talk was Piecing It Together, which was, you may well know, it was one of the texts inspired by Greenham Common, published by War Resisters International. And they tackle this, and I quote it in the book. I like their answer. They say, an individual woman facing a violent man still confronts the problem of what she as an individual will do. Does she take it, fight back? Does she leave? But a choice is made easier if she knows that other women share her experience and that she's visible and that what's happening is wrong. As long as an individual woman at home or on the streets face violence without a very active support to stop that violence, we assert the right to defend ourselves from that victimization, including physically if necessary. The basis of most women's self-defense is precisely defense, not hurting, maiming, degrading, or killing our attackers, but talking, shouting, running, and only if necessary, hitting. That was their answer then. That was the one that I reproduced in the book.
Okay, thank you. And also earlier from Sylvia, you talked about faith, that she mentions religion as conflict, e.g. Northern Ireland, and how do we stop religious conflict running down through generations? Yeah.
So religion and Christianity in particular has a lot to answer for when it comes to violence and encouraging violence. And one of the principal, I think one of the best critiques of organized religion is this role that it has played in developing violence. What I would say is that I suspect that Jesus would have agreed with that critique, because if you read the Sermon on the Mount, he specifically argues, he says, you know, you shouldn't kill, but he goes on from that and says, but you should make peace with people who you're in conflict with. So I think something in my work and in the book I try to raise up is the role of Christian peace perspectives, and to make those heard as much as possible in all of the churches, not just in the peace churches. And I think that can go a long way to supporting those institutions that have played a role in profound injustice and violence, transforming themselves into institutions that nurture peace instead.
Okay, thank you. There's some links in the, if people want to go to the chat, there's some links that you might want to follow. My colleague Jane has put links through to our collections about the Union of Democratic Control and the No Conscription Fellowship, which Tim mentioned. So you're welcome to head that way. And also there was other links that somebody put about military recruitment. So there was, things to look at there. I think, Eleanor, are you waving at me to ask a question? Right, okay, let me unmute you. Let me try and unmute you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep. One of the things that, just thinking it through, is a whole lot of cause of this sort of warring against it is competitiveness. And I wonder how, and our whole society is based on being competitive. Football, rugby, getting into university, doing all this to it. How do we detach a competitiveness that isn't aggressive and military? Or is that the ultimate question? Thanks.
You know, I was reading just last week someone making a not dissimilar point to the War and Social Order Conference in 1920. Someone saying that this whole system of industrial competition inevitably leads to war, and we need to tackle that mindset, but also that economy, if we're going to see a realistic end to war. That same person said that, you know, the friendly competition, or the friendly and non-violent competition of sports, is actually quite a positive force, was his argument, and that if we replaced national and economic competition with sports person-like competition, then that would be a good thing. But obviously, seen from the perspective of today, we do know that not exclusively, but there certainly are elements, particularly of the far right, that exploit the national feelings of supporting sporting teams to bleed into other less savoury ends. So I agree that moving towards a more cooperative method has to be part of becoming a more peaceful world.
We've got a question from Biddy. If peace is achieved by the removal of oppression, how can it be sustained when economic equality is so hard to achieve in a global context?
Oh, you know, I struggle with even getting to the point of that point where we have that peace and equal world. So it's a good question about how to sustain it. I think what I'd say is equality is good. People enjoy it. The vast majority of people are better off and would want to keep it. And peaceful relations are better off because it means that our children are not sent off to kill one another. So I would like to think that people would want to keep it because it was a good thing. But I can't promise that. Thank you for the question.
There's an interesting one from Paul Foster. Could Tim comment on ways of positively encouraging compassion?
I respect that this is not a faith space. I do come from a faith perspective, and as you may well have guessed from the references in my talk, my background is Quaker. And the central argument of that, which realize its secular form in the idea of human rights, is that every single person is sacred and every single person is connected to one another. As one of my Quaker friends likes to say very often, we are all made out of stardust. We are all of the same source. And for me, that is the source that I find for compassion, even when I'm struggling with trying to work out how to get on with someone who I really disagree. So I realize that's a personal answer, but it's a truthful answer to who I am.
Thank you. Now that just jumped down. Right, I'll get to that one. In the USA at present, can you understand why an oppressed group feel they have to go on the streets? Should they take police violence as Gandhi and Martin Luther King did?
I do understand why people take to the streets, and I don't think that it's my place as a white person in the UK to dictate what tactics Black people in the US should take.
Okay. The problem is inequality, but inequality, poverty and wars are created by capitalism, colonialism, imperialism. As a socialist, you can only challenge and change this through class struggle, and that will inevitably be violent.
I was with you all the way until the last few words. I mean, I feel like for the last 100 years, but really for the last 4,000 years, we've been in a process of experimenting with different forms of social change and different forms of power. And no method yet has achieved that full equality, including gender, race and class equality. And no society has achieved the peace that would come with it. So I don't think we can say with absolute clarity, with absolute definiteness, that the only way to reach it is through violence. And of course, there's many examples of that being attempted and not achieved, and different problems being created through the method, as I mentioned before. But I have to admit, when I say that of course, I cannot prove that non-violence is the only way to do it either. I think there's a good set of evidence that I mentioned before about non-violent struggle being doubly as successful as violent struggle. But we've still got work to do to make that lead to systems and societies of equality and peace, because that hasn't happened yet.
Thanks. From Ken Whitaker, isn't one of the major problems tribalism, regarding our own group as better or more important than other groups? Possibly. I probably wouldn't call it that. But you may well have noticed that I said that racism is an essential ingredient of war, one of the paths that leads to war. But a social scientist or big historian amongst us might point out that the concept of race has only existed for about 350 years, and there were wars before that. So, but when we trace that journey, we can see racism really coming quite directly out of religious discrimination. And of course, we have some national discrimination that goes with that. I think it is very likely that in prehistoric society, some groups, whatever collective term we might use for them, might feel that sense of identity, that sense of superiority over others, or sense that it's okay to kill people of a different type. And I think that part of the anti-racist struggle is part of overcoming that. From Phoebe, solidarity is an important concept. Explore class, justice based on idea of fairness, but is that rooted in equality? No justice, no peace, question mark.
I wonder if that, I could do with just a little bit more explanation of that one, I think.
It could, okay, yeah, it could be, well, we'll ask Phoebe to, let me see, I'll see if I can find Phoebe to see if she can ask it directly, but in the meantime, reference Twitter and Facebook. What scope is there to develop restrictions on the right, in inverted commas, of the state to threaten violence?
So I assume that this is a reference to Donald Trump, whose tweets were flagged as questionable by Twitter this week as potentially, probably more than potentially, but anyway, potentially leading to violence. I think we need to think of Twitter and Facebook in a similar way that we would the mainstream press. They're essential for getting the message out, but they are companies that will have their own agendas, and there'll be different influences on the decisions that they make. Obviously, I'm very glad that Twitter decided that they might take their role as a platform seriously and flag tweets that could lead to violence. But I don't want to assume that social media companies will always be progressive or peaceful forces, in the same way that I wouldn't expect really any newspaper to be a progressive or peaceful force, but I will celebrate everything that they do in that direction.
Okay, there's an interesting one here, which is a long one. I'll try and summarise it. Thank you for the talk. I very much enjoyed it, and I enjoy having my thoughts and understanding challenged. I've been a soldier my whole adult life. I've seen unspeakable acts of violence and evil across the world. A lot of your points seem very idealistic and out of touch with reality. I've been forced to use violence to protect people, in some cases the very vulnerable, in Bosnia and various places in Africa. I just don't recognise the world you describe. We as a nation must protect our interests and friends.
Well, I want to respect your experience and the experiences that inform what you say. I am of the view, and have long been of the view, that the most effective and very often the most eloquent and most powerful speakers for peace are not me, but are soldiers and former soldiers. Indeed, one of the maybe one of the best known pacifists ever, Leo Tolstoy, was a former soldier. So I hope that in whatever way feels right to you, you'll be able to speak out your truth. I do want to question just the last couple of sentences. We as a nation must protect our interests and our friends. I think that's worth just unpacking a little bit, because of course on the face of it, of course we do. But I want to question that idea of the nation. Is that going back to that idea of collective identity and feeling that it's okay to challenge people with a different identity, and our interests. I think I might want to ask whose interests, because very often when the government talks about national interests, what they mean is the interests of the rich, not the interests of the people that they're sending to war, or certainly not in the interests of the people who are being killed on the other side of that war. And yeah, I accept that if you see pacifism as an absolute state, no, there isn't a pacifist state in the world. But I see pacifism and peacemaking as a process. I see the creation of the welfare state as an action towards peace. I see every progressive reform that takes place in the world of racial and gender justice as a step towards peace. So their peace as a process, I think that does work, and what isn't working and what's harming people is war and injustice. That's how I'd put it.
Okay, thank you. Phoebe, I'm going to try and unmute you because you had a question earlier and Tim just wanted a bit more, so I'm just going to try and unmute you. Right, Phoebe, can you?
Yes, sorry, I did type. It was just something to explore a bit further. It was a comment because I think when we look at intersectionality and all these aspects, you know, it is how do we demonstrate solidarity? But there's always this concept of justice and fairness and whose justice, whose fairness. You know, there's potential conflict.
Yeah, there is. I think we'll all find our own ways into solidarity, and Phoebe, I know that very often you engage in acts of solidarity with different people around the world. So I know that you find a way into that as well. But yeah, if there are two groups in the world, or indeed in the UK, which part of the world, who are both in different ways oppressed and they both call out for solidarity, then that does cause the necessity to do a lot of thinking, a lot of talking, and acting in a way that brings us towards peace rather than stirring up conflicts that already exist. And I think I'm sure we can all think of major examples of that, even in UK politics in the last 2 or 3 years. So we think, we read, we talk, and we do the best that we can, and we make mistakes sometimes, and then we do better.
We have a question: what does the peace movement need to do to be more connected with issues of equality? And Jackie Burke would like to come in on that, but if you'd like to say anything on that while I try and find Jackie.
I think part of it's about showing up, and I think it's something CND's been particularly good at, especially in recent years, showing up on kind of marches to do with austerity, for example, and making the connections. I think the peace movement does also need to really think and take seriously what an intersectional approach would mean, and that does take some inner work. That's more than showing up with a banner on a march. And I hope that some of the major peace organisations, and I won't name them, but I see that there's at least a couple of staff from major peace organisations. I'd like to see some of the campaigns of those organisations, even more so, really emphasising the links between war, race, gender and class. And maybe one step to do this might be to run a big campaign that doesn't use the word war, that's to do with an issue that might be more traditionally considered a racial justice issue or a gender justice issue. And if we do that and then explain to everyone why it is that we're doing it, I think that would be very good training for moving ourselves as a peace movement towards that more intersectional approach.
Jackie, you're unmuted. Go for it.
Yeah, I'm really happy. I'm one of the workers for Greater Manchester CND, Tim, and it's really good. I was really pleased that you highlighted CND at the beginning of that, because we are very, very keen to make all of those links, as you say. We're always, like all people in the peace movement, well, like the majority of people in the peace movement, always looking to see what we can do to try and encourage and include people whose voices are not heard, people from the black and ethnic minority community. And at the moment, Greater Manchester and District CND, we're planning. I think it's got to do with something to do with confidence as well, and being prepared to lose sight of the shore, to have the confidence of doing that, and also holding yourselves up for criticism, and having the you know, the confidence to do that, and to be brave enough to do that. And something we're looking at doing at the moment, hopefully very, very soon, trying to pull it together as quickly as we can, is to hand over the reins to members of that community, and I've asked them, members of the community, of that community, if they will pull together a webinar to talk about this issue, and to give, you know, hand over our Zoom account, and say, you know, do it, and tell us what we can do. You organise it, you set it all up, and, you know, there you go. And I think we've got to be prepared to do more of that sort of thing, because no matter how much we've discussed it, no, I'm not saying that you know, that we've come up with the answer, but I think it's a start, and I think it's got to be something that the peace movement as a whole has got to be prepared to do.
Thank you.
Okay, we've got a question from Gordon Benson. Do you think that sections of the left glorify violent struggle?
Well, yes, obviously it does, parts of it. Yeah. That's the literal answer to the question.
Okay. Right, I'm trying to keep up with messages. There's lots of very nice messages from people saying how inspirational they find it, etc. So I'm just trying to see whether let me try and make this bigger. Okay, I think. Oh no, here's one. What happened to paternalism? There were once rich people who used their money to fund Quaker and other churches or to help their tenants. The modern rich seem to be less connected, even philanthropists like Bill and Melinda Gates.
Okay, and I imagine that's going to be the last one.
Well, I don't know. There's a couple of, I think, yes, actually, I think the ones that are coming in now are sort of thank you ones. So we could see that as a final question. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, it brings us actually quite nicely round to where I started, because the early 20th century was the time where the Quaker community really made quite a big shift from being associated with chocolate and banking to being associated with peace and social change. And I think, of course, I'm very glad that organisations like the Cadburys and the Rowntrees funded organisations like the UDC, the major donors to the UDC. But I'm very sceptical about paternalism as a method of social change. I'm sure many people on this call, probably most people on this call, will be familiar with the story of the Bryant and May match workers, match girls strike in the east of London. Bryant and May was a Quaker company. So one of the major stories that shape modern trade union work comes from a campaign against a company that considered itself to be quite progressive. It thought of itself as quite paternalistic. They said, oh, isn't it great? We're trying to invent the safety match. But it took those match girls, with the support of Annie Besant, walking out on strike to make the company see the error of its ways and to lead to the change that means that we have much safer matches today. So I think, obviously, I prefer a relatively kind business to an extraordinarily exploitative one. But I think that without the pressure from below, even people who think of themselves as beneficent owners sometimes forget their consciences and need to be reminded by people struggling from below.
Okay, well, we have covered a lot of ground here. Thank you very much indeed, Tim. So even having negotiated a lot of questions ahead of time, you've tackled a great range of them during the course of our last few minutes. So if you tuned in late, we are going to be uploading the whole talk, including all the Q&A, to our YouTube channel, hopefully later today. That's youtube.com/WCM Library. There's been a lot to absorb today, so if you want to hear it again, then you're very welcome to do that. There were some really interesting links in the chat, which if you want to follow them, do click on them before you leave the meeting today. And we do hope that you will be joining us again next week, same time, 2 o'clock on Wednesday, the 10th of June. Next week, we have Michael Herbert talking to us on Doctor Who and the Communist, the writing and politics of Malcolm Hulke. Do not say that we do not give you an eclectic mix of topics here with the Invisible Histories talks. So thank you very much indeed to Tim for giving us a lot of food for thought. Thank you to all of you for contributing so much. And talking of contributions, is an unsubtle link, just a reminder that there is a donate button on our website that we would love you to use if you are able to do that. So thanks again and goodbye until next week. And as we say, take care. In solidarity, the Working Class Movement Library say goodbye.